Detective Nolan Gray adjusted his tie, staring at the imposing facade of the Hollow Oaks Psychiatric Facility. Nestled on the outskirts of the city, the hospital's Gothic architecture loomed against a gray sky, its spires piercing the clouds. He wasn't a man easily unnerved, but something about this case felt different. Inside, the head psychiatrist, Dr. Eleanor Vance, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Detective Gray, thank you for coming. I assume you've been briefed." "Not in detail," Nolan admitted. "I know you had an incident involving a patient's death. What's not clear is why a homicide detective was called in for what the report lists as a suicide." Dr. Vance's lips tightened. "Because it wasn't a suicide." She motioned for him to follow her. "The patient, Richard Haynes, was found in his room early yesterday morning. Cause of death was a fatal injection of insulin. He wasn't diabetic." Nolan frowned. "And you think someone here killed him?" "I know someone did." She led him to the patient's room, a sterile space with a single bed and a barred window. "Our staff is thoroughly vetted, but we've had issues recently. There's been tension among the patients, especially between Haynes and another resident, Peter Caldwell." "Caldwell?" Nolan pulled out his notebook. "What's his story?" Dr. Vance hesitated. "He was admitted 3 months ago. Claimed to be suffering from severe paranoia and delusions. But frankly, I've always had doubts about his diagnosis. Caldwell is different. He's remarkably lucid for someone supposedly in his condition." Nolan's pen paused mid-scribble. "You think he's faking it?" "It's possible. He's clever, manipulative even. And he had a history with Richard Haynes outside this facility. They worked together years ago. Haynes accused Caldwell of embezzlement, which led to Caldwell losing everything: his career, his family. He's made no secret of his resentment." Nolan's instincts prickled. "Sounds like a motive." "Indeed." Dr. Vance sighed. "But Caldwell is cunning. If he did this, he covered his tracks well." Nolan spent the next few hours interviewing staff and patients. Most were tight-lipped or genuinely seemed to know nothing. Then came Peter Caldwell. Caldwell was seated in the common room, flipping through a dog-eared copy of Crime and Punishment. He looked up as Nolan approached, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Detective Gray, I presume?" His voice was calm, measured. "Come to unravel the mystery of poor Richard's demise?" Nolan sat across from him. "You seem remarkably well-informed." Caldwell's smirk widened. "Oh, word travels fast in places like this. Besides, Richard and I had history. Naturally, people assume I'm involved." "Are you?" Nolan asked bluntly. Caldwell chuckled. "If I were, do you think I'd admit it?" He leaned back, studying Nolan with sharp, calculating eyes. "Richard was a man with many enemies. Perhaps you should broaden your scope." "You mean like the staff?" "Oh, I'd never suggest such a thing." Caldwell's tone dripped with mock innocence. "But in a place like this, emotions run high. People snap." The conversation went in circles, Caldwell deflecting every question with ease. But Nolan's gut told him the man was hiding something. The real breakthrough came when he examined the facility's surveillance footage. Caldwell had been in the hallway near Haynes' room the night of the murder, but the camera angle didn't show him entering. Nolan requested Caldwell's medical records. As Dr. Vance had suggested, there were inconsistencies in his diagnosis. Caldwell's supposed episodes of paranoia didn't align with his behavior on camera or during interviews. But the final piece of the puzzle was a nurse who came forward, anonymously slipping Nolan a note. It read, "Caldwell isn't sick. He's here for revenge." Armed with this, Nolan confronted Caldwell again. This time, the man's smug veneer cracked slightly. Caldwell didn't outright confess, but his choice of words and demeanor hinted at a deeper involvement. "Revenge is such a misunderstood concept, Detective," Caldwell said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. "Sometimes it's not about anger. It's about justice." Nolan's jaw tightened. "Justice? Is that what you call what happened to Haynes?" Caldwell's smile returned, cold and deliberate. "Haynes made choices. Choices that ruined lives. People like him think they can get away with it. Perhaps someone decided otherwise." Before Nolan could press further, an orderly interrupted, informing them that another patient had been found unconscious, another suspected insulin overdose. The chaos that ensued made it clear the hospital was on edge. Staff scrambled to tend to the patient, while Dr. Vance issued a lockdown order. Caldwell was placed under stricter surveillance, confined to his room, but Nolan wasn't convinced the danger had passed. Nolan began piecing together the timeline. How had Caldwell, a supposedly monitored patient, accessed insulin? Did he have help from the inside? As he interviewed more staff, he uncovered small but suspicious details. A missing syringe reported weeks earlier, a staff member who had been unusually close to Caldwell, and the revelation that Haynes had been trying to leave the facility before his death. Haynes' file revealed that he had recently contacted a lawyer, attempting to secure his release. According to the lawyer's notes, Haynes feared for his life. He believed Caldwell had recognized him and was plotting something. Nolan's suspicion deepened. If Haynes had been trying to escape, it meant he'd been aware of a threat but felt powerless to stop it. Late one evening, Nolan revisited Caldwell's room. It was sparsely furnished, with little to suggest Caldwell had engaged in any hobbies or activities during his stay. However, Nolan noticed a meticulously folded piece of paper tucked under Caldwell's mattress. Unfolding it, he found a crude map of the hospital, with certain areas circled in red: the infirmary, the supply closet, and Haynes' room. It was enough to secure Caldwell's isolation, but not enough to definitively prove his guilt. "Is this your masterpiece?" Nolan asked Caldwell the next morning, showing him the map. Caldwell's expression didn't waver. "I'd be insulted if you thought my plans were so amateurish." Nolan's patience thinned. "You're playing games, Caldwell. But people are getting hurt. If you're trying to make a point, it ends now." Caldwell leaned back, a glimmer of something. Satisfaction? Amusement? In his eyes. "You're looking in the wrong places, Detective." "Am I?" Nolan countered, leaning in. "Because everything, your history with Haynes, your proximity the night he died, and now this, points to you." For the first time, Caldwell's mask slipped. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he regained his composure. "You should ask yourself, Detective, why someone like me was ever admitted here in the first place. And who's really pulling the strings." The words stayed with Nolan as he reviewed the case that night. Caldwell wasn't wrong. His admission to Hollow Oaks didn't entirely add up. He wasn't just clever, he was calculating, almost too polished to have ended up in a psychiatric facility without reason. Nolan began to wonder if Caldwell's placement here had been intentional, part of a larger, hidden agenda. Digging deeper, Nolan accessed Caldwell's initial intake records, cross-referencing them with hospital logs. A pattern emerged, one that hinted at manipulation. The attending psychiatrist during Caldwell's admission was no longer employed at Hollow Oaks, but her notes seemed off. She described a man teetering on the edge of psychosis, but the handwriting in Caldwell's file was inconsistent, as though someone else had added to or altered the records after the fact. Nolan needed answers, and fast. That same night, he requested to see Dr. Vance in her office. She was visibly exhausted from the chaos of the past few days, but agreed to meet him. "There's something wrong here," Nolan said, placing the altered files on her desk. "Caldwell's admission records have been doctored. Someone wanted him in this facility." Dr. Vance's face paled. "What are you suggesting, Detective?" "I'm suggesting Caldwell may not be acting alone. He's too precise, too deliberate. Someone wanted him close to Haynes, close enough to orchestrate his death. And now, another patient has been targeted. I need to know if there's someone on your staff who might be involved." Dr. Vance hesitated, but Nolan pressed. "Every facility has its cracks. People are human. Someone might have been bribed, blackmailed, or coerced. If we don't act, more people could die." Finally, she relented. "There's one person. Nurse Allison Kerr. She's only been here 6 months, but there have been rumors. Staff said she's been overly familiar with Caldwell, sharing cigarettes, slipping him things like extra food or books." Nolan latched onto the lead. "Where is she now?" "I sent her home earlier today after she reported feeling ill." Alarm bells went off in Nolan's head. "We need to search her locker." They found it quickly, an unassuming gray box in the staff room. Inside, alongside her personal belongings, was a small, unmarked vial and a syringe. The vial contained traces of insulin. It was the break Nolan needed, but it still left questions unanswered. Was Nurse Kerr the mastermind, or had she been manipulated by Caldwell? The next day, Nolan confronted Caldwell once more, this time with the vial in hand. "Your friend Nurse Kerr made a mistake." Caldwell's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. "Mistake? I wasn't aware we were friends. Don't play coy with me. She's been helping you, hasn't she? Smuggling things, covering for you." Caldwell tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Detective, you give me far too much credit. I'm just a man enjoying the hospitality of this fine institution." "You know, Caldwell," Nolan said, stepping closer, "you're right about one thing. Someone wanted you here. Someone who knew Haynes was vulnerable. But here's the thing. Puppets don't always realize they're being controlled." Caldwell's gaze sharpened. "What are you implying? That you're not the endgame. You're just another piece on the board." Nolan's voice dropped to a growl. "And I'm going to find out who's playing the game." The accusation hit its mark. Caldwell's confidence wavered, his mask of arrogance slipping entirely. For the first time, Nolan saw genuine fear in his eyes. Before Nolan could push further, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Another patient, a young woman, had reportedly attacked a nurse, screaming that the shadow was coming for her. The staff subdued her, but Nolan caught a glimpse of her terrified face as they wheeled her away. Dr. Vance appeared at his side, her expression grim. "Detective, whatever you think is happening here, it's bigger than just one patient or one death." Nolan nodded, his resolve hardening. "It always is."